St. Louis's Boeing prepares for a strike after thousands of union workers rejected a contract offer.
Space workers, District 837, union officials here saying their members overwhelmingly rejected
$2 billion in new military assistance for Ukraine. $800 million of this will help strengthen Ukraine's arsenal for the most urgently needed defense equipment.
You know, they don't pay very much for military, and the reason they don't pay much is they assume that we're going to protect them.
We have a very small military. They rely on our military. We basically protect Canada.
We've made major investments in defense in recent months. We're committed to accelerating that.
Some other countries are also reviewing their contracts to buy these very expensive fighter jets from the U.S. over trade concerns.
Canada just pulled off a move that Washington never thought possible. Billions of dollars in fighter jet contracts, once seen as America's birthright, have been ripped away and handed to someone else. Overnight, one of the United States' closest allies sent shockwaves through the Pentagon and Wall Street alike. Think about it. For decades, American-made jets like the F-16, the F-18, and the F-35 weren't just aircraft. They were symbols of U.S. dominance, the backbone of NATO, and the pride of America's defense industry. Whenever allies needed cutting-edge air power, they turned to Washington. It was automatic. It was unquestioned. But now, Canada just broke that tradition in the most dramatic way possible. Instead of writing another check to U.S. giants like Boeing or Lockheed Martin, Ottawa turned its back and chose a coalition of foreign manufacturers to supply its next-generation fighter jets. It's the first time in modern history that America has been shut out of a Canadian defense project of this scale. The decision has left U.S. officials scrambling, defense workers furious, and politicians demanding answers. Yet behind the headlines lies something even bigger, a warning that America's grip on global defense markets might be slipping. Because if Canada can walk away, what's stopping Japan, Australia, or Europe from doing the same? And here's the real question. Was this just about fighter jets, or was it about something much deeper, like trade wars, tariffs, and broken trust between allies? The answer could reshape not only America's defense industry, but the balance of power itself.
When the news first broke in Ottawa, it landed like a thunderclap. Canada's government announced that it had signed a multi-billion-dollar contract for next-generation fighter jets. Only this time, the deal didn't go to America's aerospace giants. For decades, whenever Canada needed high-tech weapons, the orders flowed south, straight into the factories of Lockheed Martin in Texas or Boeing in Missouri. It was tradition, it was expectation, it was seen as unshakable. But this time, that expectation shattered. Instead of buying American, Canada turned to a coalition of overseas manufacturers. The deal would see new jets assembled in Montreal, with critical components sourced from Europe and beyond. For the first time in living memory, a Canadian defense project of this scale had completely shut out U.S. companies. To put that in perspective, American aircraft had been the backbone of NATO air forces since the Cold War. Generations of Canadian pilots trained in American jets. Entire strategies, war games, and missions were built on that assumption. So when Ottawa's decision came down, it wasn't just a business contract lost. It was a geopolitical earthquake. The shock was immediate. In Washington, Pentagon officials admitted they were blindsided. Lawmakers in Congress demanded urgent briefings. And in America's defense hubs, from Seattle to Fort Worth to St. Louis, workers and executives alike were left asking the same stunned question: how could Canada do this to us? But Canada's message was clear. By awarding the contract overseas, Ottawa was signaling that it no longer wanted to be entirely dependent on American suppliers, especially after years of bruising trade disputes, tariffs on steel and aluminum, and constant uncertainty over U.S. policy. In other words, this wasn't just a contract. It was a warning shot. And as the dust settled, one thing became obvious. The ripple effects of this decision were about to spread far beyond Canada's borders, hitting American towns, jobs, and even its global reputation.
While Ottawa celebrated its bold move across the border in the United States, the mood couldn't have been more different. In Fort Worth, Texas, home to Lockheed Martin's massive fighter jet plant, workers gathered outside the factory gates in disbelief. For years, they had watched F-35s roll off the assembly line, confident that Canada's orders would keep the production lines humming for decades. But overnight, those orders vanished. Union leaders warned that layoffs were no longer just a possibility. They were inevitable. Thousands of machinists, engineers, and technicians who had dedicated their lives to building America's most advanced aircraft suddenly found themselves staring at an uncertain future. And it wasn't just Texas. In St. Louis, Missouri, where Boeing's defense division anchors the local economy, the shock was just as brutal. Entire neighborhoods depend on those paychecks. Suppliers, from aluminum plants in the Midwest to avionics firms in California, were thrown into chaos. The contracts they had counted on for years were suddenly gone, leaving factories scrambling to figure out what to do next. Economists quickly rang the alarm. More than 20,000 American jobs could be at risk if this trend continues. And it wouldn't just be corporate giants that suffered. Small subcontractors, the family-owned machine shops, the specialized parts makers stood on the edge of collapse. But behind the numbers were real people. A diner waitress in Missouri pouring coffee for laid-off machinists. A teacher in Texas quietly worrying about shrinking school budgets as local tax revenue evaporates. Families who had built entire lives around defense jobs suddenly found themselves wondering if the very policies meant to protect American workers had backfired. Because here's the irony. The trade fights and tariffs that Washington imposed, meant to shield U.S. industries from foreign competition, may have been the very thing that pushed Canada to walk away. And for thousands of Americans, that realization cut deeper than the layoffs themselves.
The loss of jobs was devastating, but the real wound cut much deeper, straight into the heart of America's image as the world's undisputed defense powerhouse. For decades, U.S. fighter jets weren't just machines of war. They were symbols of American dominance. The F-16, the F/A-18, and most recently the F-35 weren't just aircraft. They were emblems of technological superiority, showcased at air shows, splashed across recruitment posters, and flown proudly by America's closest allies. They were proof that when nations needed cutting-edge air power, they turned to Washington without hesitation. But Canada's decision shattered that assumption. Suddenly, one of the United States' most reliable allies was signaling to the world that America was no longer the automatic supplier of choice. It was as if a silent contract of trust had been broken. Inside the Pentagon, the reaction was one of disbelief. Officials admitted they had been caught completely flat-footed. Negotiators expected the usual routine: discussions, a few concessions, and then a massive U.S. win. Instead, they were faced with outright rejection. For defense planners, who had built strategies around the idea that Allied air forces would remain made in America, the ground had just shifted beneath their feet, and the rest of the world noticed. Observers in Europe, Asia, and beyond took Canada's move as a sign that the era of guaranteed U.S. dominance in defense sales might be ending. If even Canada, America's closest neighbor, NATO partner, and cultural cousin, could walk away, then why not Australia? Why not Japan? Why not Poland? It wasn't just about losing a contract. It was about losing prestige, influence, and trust. Fighter jets, after all, are more than military hardware. They're extensions of diplomacy, instruments of alliance, and symbols of who a country chooses to depend on in times of crisis. And for the first time in decades, Canada was saying, we don't just depend on America anymore. For U.S. defense officials, that realization was a gut punch. For politicians back home, it was a nightmare waiting to explode. If the Pentagon felt blindsided, Washington's politicians felt humiliated. Within hours of the announcement, phones in congressional offices from Texas to Missouri lit up. Lawmakers representing districts built around defense plants demanded answers, and fast. These weren't just defense contracts. They were lifelines for entire communities. Fort Worth, St. Louis, Wichita, Seattle, cities where aerospace isn't just an industry, it's an identity. For decades, senators and representatives had boasted about bringing home the bacon in the form of billion-dollar fighter jet orders. Now, they were faced with explaining to their voters why those orders had vanished overnight. The fury wasn't confined to Congress. Governors, mayors, and local officials began raising alarms. School districts warned of shrinking budgets if defense jobs disappeared. Mayors spoke of neighborhoods that might hollow out. Small-town America, where aerospace plants often sit at the center of the economy, suddenly faced a grim future. And the anger wasn't just economic. Politically, the optics were disastrous. The U.S. government had spent years justifying tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and aircraft parts as necessary to protect American jobs. Yet here was the cruel twist. Those very tariffs may have pushed Canada into the arms of Europe. The policy meant to safeguard American workers had, in practice, sent thousands of jobs overseas. Lawmakers pounced on the irony. How could we let this happen? They demanded in hearing. How could one of our closest allies, our neighbor, turn its back on us? Questions flew toward the White House and the Pentagon, but the answers were vague, defensive, and unsatisfying. Behind closed doors, officials admitted what many already suspect. They had underestimated Canada's willingness to retaliate. The fallout grew uglier by the day. Editorials blasted the administration for failing to see the warning sign. Union leaders accused Washington of sacrificing workers for the sake of political grandstand, and defense lobbyists, usually confident in their influence, suddenly looked nervous. For the first time in years, their grip on policy seemed shaky. But even as the shouting grew louder in Washington, analysts warned that the real danger wasn't the politics of today. It was the long-term shift unfolding quietly in the background. Because this wasn't just one lost deal, it was the beginning of something much larger, something that could permanently alter America's role in the global defense market. While Washington wrestled with political fallout, the rest of the world was watching closely, and the message they received was crystal clear. America's dominance in the global defense market was no longer guaranteed. For decades, U.S. defense giants like Boeing and Lockheed Martin enjoyed something close to monopoly status among America's allies. If you were part of NATO or a close U.S. partner in Asia, you bought American jets. It wasn't even up for debate. The logic was simple: interoperability, prestige, and trust. But Canada just shattered that logic with a single stroke of the pen. Suddenly, countries that had long been in line for U.S. aircraft started asking uncomfortable questions. In Europe, nations like Poland, Italy, and even Germany wondered if Canada, a founding NATO member, can turn to European manufacturers. Why shouldn't we? After all, supporting European defense industries meant keeping jobs and technology closer to home, while avoiding dependence on the unpredictable politics of Washington. In Asia, the ripple was just as strong. Japan and South Korea, two of America's closest security partners, had been debating whether to diversify their fighter jet fleets. Canada's bold move gave them a precedent. If Canada could integrate European jets into NATO operations, then surely Asian allies could do the same. Even Australia, which had poured billions into US-made aircraft, began weighing its options more carefully. And this wasn't just about prestige. It was about money. By stepping away from U.S. suppliers, Canada sent a signal that better deals might be found elsewhere. European defense firms, hungry for market share, suddenly had the momentum to offer lower prices, sweeter offsets, and new technology partnerships. For nations looking to stretch defense budgets, the temptation was obvious. Analysts called it the start of a multipolar defense economy. No longer would the U.S. automatically dominate allied procurement. Instead, contracts would flow in multiple directions, toward Europe, toward Asia, even toward joint international projects that deliberately excluded America. And here's the dangerous part. Once those contracts move overseas, they rarely come back. Each lost sale isn't just lost revenue, it's lost influence, lost leverage, and lost trust. America's position as the arsenal of democracy wasn't collapsing overnight, but the foundation was cracking. What Canada had done wasn't just a procurement choice, it was a spark, and the fire it started was already spreading across the globe. At first glance, Canada's decision looked like it was only about planes, but underneath, the shock reached into a far more delicate system, the sprawling supply chains that keep America's defense machine alive. A fighter jet isn't built in one factory. It's a puzzle made up of thousands of pieces sourced from all over the world. Titanium from Canadian mines, aluminum forged in the American Midwest, advanced avionics from California, rare earth minerals pulled from Asia. Every bolt, every sensor, every engine component flows through a complex network that spans continents. When Ottawa cut American companies out of its fighter program, it didn't just threaten Boeing or Lockheed, it pulled a thread in that entire web. If Canada sources its parts from Europe, then the ripple effect is brutal. American foundries lose orders, machine shops in small towns sit idle, and suppliers that expanded to meet expected Canadian demand are suddenly left with warehouses full of unused capacity. The danger isn't just temporary. Once these orders shift overseas, they create new habits, new dependencies, new factories in other countries, mines in Scandinavia, electronics labs in Japan, and assembly plants in Germany could expand to take the business America just lost. And every new investment abroad means one less reason for those jobs and technologies to return to U.S. soil. Even more concerning, this trend could weaken America's grip on strategic material. Fighter jets require rare earth elements, materials vital for sensors, targeting systems, and stealth technology. If demand starts flowing toward non-U.S. suppliers, Washington risks losing leverage in markets it once dominated. That means less control over the inputs that power its own military. The cascade effect is real. A forging plant in Ohio loses its orders, then lays off workers. A chip manufacturer in Arizona scales back production. A steel mill in Pennsylvania closes a line. Each small cut by itself might go unnoticed, but together they form a slow bleed of America's industrial base. And here's the chilling part. Supply chains don't just shift, they lock in. Once Canada commits to building a jet with European components, its maintenance, upgrades, and replacement parts will come from those same suppliers for decades. That's not just one lost sale, it's an entire future revenue stream gone. For Washington, this was more than economic pain. It was a strategic warning. If supply chains realign away from the U.S., America's ability to project power globally will erode, not because of what happens on the battlefield, but because of what happens in the factories that make the weapons. If Canada's decision rattled Washington, it outright electrified America's allies in Asia. For decades, countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia had anchored their air forces around U.S.-made jets. The F-15S, F-16S, and F-35s that flew over the Pacific weren't just military assets. They were proof of loyalty to the United States, a visible reminder that these nations stood firmly in Washington's camp. But when Ottawa broke tradition and picked foreign suppliers, it sent an unmistakable signal across the Pacific. America is no longer your only option. Japan, already experimenting with joint fighter projects with Britain and Italy, suddenly found fresh justification to diversify. Why remain locked into U.S. hardware when even Canada, America's closest neighbor, was breaking away? South Korea, with its rapidly growing domestic aerospace industry, began eyeing more independence as well. And in Canberra, Australian strategists quietly debated whether relying too heavily on Washington could one day leave them vulnerable. This wasn't just about economics. It was about strategy. The U.S. military had long clung to a doctrine known informally as one fleet, one fight. The idea was simple. If every ally flew American aircraft, coalition warfare would be seamless. Shared logistics, shared training, shared command structures, everyone on the same page. Canada's move ripped a hole in that doctrine. If one NATO partner could successfully integrate European jets, then Asian allies might feel emboldened to do the same. But mixed fleets create new headaches. Every non-American plane means different spare parts, different training, different systems to maintain. The smooth interoperability the Pentagon had counted on suddenly looked fragile. For U.S. planners, that wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential weakness in any future conflict. Imagine a Pacific showdown where American jets had to fight alongside allies flying aircraft the U.S. didn't design, couldn't fully support, and maybe didn't even trust. The seamless one-fight vision could turn into a patchwork coalition riddled with gaps. And here's the kicker. America's rivals noticed too. Beijing and Moscow watched closely, realizing that cracks in U.S. alliances didn't always come from the battlefield. They could start in boardrooms, trade dispute, or procurement deal. Every ally that shifted away from U.S. aircraft was one less country locked into Washington's orbit. Canada might have only signed one contract, but the dominoes it set in motion stretched all the way to the Pacific. And once they started falling, stopping them would be far harder than Washington wanted to admit. For America, losing a contract is painful. Losing jobs is devastating. But losing its reputation, that cuts to the bone. Since World War II, the United States has proudly carried the title of the arsenal of democracy. When the free world needed weapons to hold back tyranny, it was American factories that delivered. From the Sherman tanks that rolled across Europe to the F-16S that ruled the skies of NATO, America's defense industry wasn't just a supplier. It was a symbol, a living promise that U.S. technology, U.S. power, and U.S. leadership would always be at the center of global security. But Canada's decision cracked that narrative in half. It wasn't about whether the U.S. could still build the best jets. It could. It wasn't about whether American technology still led the world. It did. The shock came from something deeper. Trust had been broken. Because if even Canada, America's closest neighbor, NATO ally, and cultural twin, was willing to walk away. What did that say about U.S. reliability? For allies around the world, the move suggested that Washington could no longer be counted on as the automatic, unquestioned choice. The aura of inevitability was gone. Inside America, the emotional impact was just as heavy. For machinists who had spent their careers building planes, the loss wasn't just a paycheck. It felt like a betrayal. For engineers who saw their designs as symbols of national pride, it was a humiliation. For communities that had built their identity around aerospace, it was a shock to the system. And psychologically, the danger went beyond borders. If America's friends began to doubt the U.S., then America's rivals would start to believe they had room to rise. Every ally that chose a European or Asian supplier wasn't just shifting money, it was shifting loyalty piece by piece. In many ways, Canada's decision planted a seed of doubt that Washington had never faced before. For the first time in decades, the world was openly asking, is America still the arsenal of democracy? Or just another player in a crowded market? That question wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Because once prestige slips, once identity cracks, restoring it takes far longer than losing it. And as America grappled with that question, one region of the world was already celebrating. While Washington scrambled to explain its loss, across the Atlantic, the mood was entirely different. In Europe, defense leaders and aerospace executives could barely contain their satisfaction. Canada's decision wasn't just a contract win, it was a statement. For the first time in decades, a major NATO ally had chosen European aircraft over American ones, and the political symbolism was impossible to ignore. For years, European defense firms like Airbus, Dassault, and Saab had been playing second fiddle to U.S. giants. Their planes were capable, sometimes even superior in niche areas, but when push came to shove, allies defaulted to American jets. Why? Because interoperability with the U.S. was seen as essential, and because buying American was the safe political choice. But Ottawa shattered that tradition. By putting its trust and its billions into European hands, Canada effectively gave Europe's defense industry a credibility boost that money alone couldn't buy. Suddenly, the Eurofighter Typhoon, France's Rafale, and Sweden's Gripen weren't just alternatives. They were legitimate competitors on the world stage, backed by the precedent of a trusted U.S. ally. European leaders seized the moment. In Berlin and Paris, officials openly celebrated the fact that Europe no longer had to live in America's defense shadow. In Brussels, NATO policymakers noted that Canada's decision proved the alliance could operate without exclusive reliance on Washington. For countries frustrated with U.S. tariffs, trade wars, and unpredictable politics, this was a powerful reminder. You don't have to depend on America. Even smaller nations took notice. Poland, long considered firmly in Washington's corner, began talking more openly about diversifying its defense purchases. Italy and Spain, both with deep ties to European aerospace programs, saw Canada's move as validation of their own investment. And for France, long a critic of American dominance in NATO. It was nothing short of vindication. The timing couldn't have been better for Europe. With plans already underway for the Franco-German Future Combat Air System and Britain's Tempest program, Canada's choice injected momentum into projects that had struggled to gain traction. Now, European firms had not only financial resources, but also political prestige to back their ambition. In short, Canada's decision didn't just punish the US, it empowered Europe. It rebalanced influence inside NATO, giving European defense industries a stronger hand in future negotiations. And it raised a troubling question for Washington. If even NATO members start buying European jets over American ones, how long before the balance of power inside the alliance itself begins to tilt? What started as just another defense contract ended up shaking the very foundations of America's global dominance. Canada's choice to sideline U.S. aerospace giants wasn't simply about buying jets. It was about trust, independence, and leverage. In Texas and Missouri, the fallout meant lost jobs and shuttered factories. In Washington, it triggered anger, hearings, and blame. Across the Atlantic, it fueled Europe's rise as a serious rival in the defense market. And in Asia, it emboldened allies to consider whether their future security really needs to rest on American hardware alone. The economic consequences will stretch far beyond today. Supply chains will reroute. Skilled workers may never return once factories close. And the research and innovation once underwritten by export contracts could wither without foreign orders to fund them. America's defense edge isn't just about technology. It's about the ecosystem of jobs, suppliers, and trust that supports it. And Canada just showed how fragile that ecosystem really is. But perhaps the most important consequence isn't economic at all. It's psychological. For decades, the U.S. carried itself as the unquestioned arsenal of democracy. The nation allies could always count on, and rivals could never match. That aura of inevitability is now gone. If even Canada, Washington's closest neighbor and ally, can break from tradition, then every other partner will at least think twice. So, where does that leave the United States? At a crossroads, Washington can choose to rebuild trust, rolling back trade wars, reassuring allies, and proving that American leadership is about more than just muscle. Or it can double down on confrontation, risking further isolation as allies quietly diversify their options. Because here's the truth. Fighter jets may be weapons of war, but this contract was something bigger. It was a test of trust. And Canada's decision has made one thing painfully clear. America can no longer assume loyalty. It has to earn it. And that's the thought that should keep leaders in Washington awake at night.